Still have a few minutes. Do we want to wait a few minutes and see if more join, Richard, or do you just want to begin?
Yeah, let's wait a few minutes. I just
Okay,
decided to set up the stream and start recording.
sure.
So this can go on our YouTube channel. And just as a warning, I was planning on doing this from the ice arena. I'm the technical director down there, volunteer, of course, but we have a hockey game tonight. I was going to go down and get some stuff done, but I got a text that said that I can't get in the building until 3:30, which is an hour and a half from now. So if I disappear, I will still monitor with my phone and um, go from there.
Okay.
But I will leave the stream and the recording up on this computer. It's my media box, and then
Hmm.
we'll go from there. So just a heads up, it's not going to change anything, but I just want to let everybody be aware of what's going on. So. Oh, let me get you the information on Poop Deck because I think that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, that'd be great. And that deck that the passengers on the Titanic were clinging to as she sank, um, would that be the poop deck? Or is
Yeah,
that totally different?
on the
Okay.
very back. Naval architecture Poop Deck is the deck that forms the roof of a cabin built in the rear or aft part of the superstructure of a ship. Um, the name originates from the French word for stern, la poupe, which
Oh,
from the Latin pupus, thus the poop deck is technically a stern deck, in which sailing ships usually elevated as the roof of the cabin. So that's where it came from, the poop, meaning stern. So
ah,
a lot of nautical terms like that are, it's kind of interesting where they came from because you've got words like futtock, Futtock, um, and the ceiling on a ship is not what we consider a ceiling
mm-hmm.
here. The ceiling on a ship is actually the planks that are laid on an old wooden ship on top of the ribs that form the basically the deck for the whole, but it's right on the ribs. It's not a flat deck
Oh,
ceiling, and it's just really interesting where a lot of these things came from.
right.
I've been sailing since I was a wee kid, so
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Oh, wow.
okay.
Yeah, my only experience of sailing is only being on I guess like, it's some kind of transport from England to, I think Belgium, and that's the only time I've been at sea.
Well, I've got a quick story that I'll tell, and then we'll let Wade take over.
Okay.
The When I was back in the '80s, there was a yacht that was based in Newport Beach, California, called the Lovely Lady.
Okay.
128 feet motor yacht, and it was the Wrigley family yacht from the Wrigley chewing gum fame. They were the ones that pretty much founded Catalina Island and set up the little town of Avalon there and everything. Uh,
Oh,
and then it was also General MacArthur's yacht. So anyway, we finished the show, and the theater company I was working for decided to charter the boat and take it over to Catalina Island for the day. Well, we went over to Catalina and, having a good time on the yacht. But then the captain got a distress call, and one of the assistant coaches for the then Los Angeles Rams was over there in a stern drive and had his stern drive go out. So he was pretty much dead in the water in his boat. So we responded to the distress call. We took the boat in tow, which basically we tied his boat to the side of the lovely lady. And the captain was in a pinch because the crewmen that he normally have for wheel watch, he'd have to pull somebody up off to do tow watch, which basically meant he had to watch the lines and stuff on the tow to make sure that it still was connected to the boat and everything. So I got drafted to stand wheel watch in the bridge of the lovely lady all by myself.
Oh, wow.
And so here I am, a passenger.
Yeah.
We need to admit, Alicia. So here I am, a passenger, and I'm sitting there taking the boat in the dark across from Catalina
Wow.
to Newport. I'm
Yeah.
going across the shipping lanes,
Uh-huh.
and I was the only one on board who had the experience and everything to do it. So,
Yeah.
the captain was like, this is, we're not supposed to be doing this, but I'm glad you're here. So yeah, I took the boat all the way over. We didn't have an autopilot on it, so it was steering by compass the entire way. And afterwards, he offered me a job, and I was already doing theater and having fun. So,
Yeah.
I turned down being a yachty, and I
Uh-huh.
wish I kept doing it. But,
Yeah.
um, strange things. Boat went to Florida, and somebody sank it. So
Oh boy.
I don't know if it's going to be restored or what. So anyway, let me pop over here and then throw a slide up, and then everybody can see that. So there is our introduction to Wade. And go ahead, Wade, take it away.
Thank you, Richard. I want to thank Jill and Terry and Richard for making this possible. And I'm glad for everybody who joined today, who's part of the Titanic Book Club. I wanted to start with just a little bit of an intro about me and how I got interested in the Titanic and what made me think of writing a book. And I think for a lot of Titanic fans, for me, it started with A Night to Remember. I read this book in 6th grade for a book report and got hooked on it from there. This is very similar to the book that I actually checked out at my school library back in 1984. And then, I don't know, how many of you got interested in the Titanic by a show of hands before Jim Cameron's movie? Or is it just me?
Yeah.
Okay. So you probably remember how hard it was to find Titanic books in like the 70s and 80s because all of the older books were out of print, and it was before the craze that was brought about by the movie. But I did manage to find my own paperback copy of A Night to Remember, which I carried with me everywhere starting in 6th grade. And as you can actually see, it's fallen apart and I had to tape it back together. I've probably read this actual copy of Night to Remember about 200 times at least. And from there, I started collecting the other books. And one of the things, so I became interested in the Titanic in 6th grade. And I was looking through the almanac and I found that there was a group called the Titanic Historical Society listed in organizations. So I wrote to them and asked if I could join. And I didn't know if someone my age would even be allowed. And of course, they sent me the membership application in the mail. And so I applied to be a member and joined. I joined the Titanic Historical Society about 6 months before they found the wreck, which was also astounding to me because I never thought in my lifetime we would actually know where the Titanic was and see pictures of it. So that was pretty amazing. But then as my interest in the Titanic developed, and I became a journalism major in college, and I worked for a newspaper after graduation. And the more Titanic books I read, I noticed that the Olympic was always kind of a footnote, and certainly the Olympics' involvement in the disaster was a footnote, and the description was almost always the same. It said, you know, Olympic was 500 miles away, it was too far away to help, and when they found out the Titanic sank, they canceled the concerts and they started raising money for the victims fund. And that was really, for the most part, that was what you got to know about the Olympic. And the more you read about the Titanic, you start to look for angles that haven't been developed that you can learn more. And so I just started keeping a file. Anytime I read a tidbit about the Olympic on that week, I kind of put it away because I wanted to always have access to, well, what else do we know about that? And then I found that New York Times article that was published on the 13th of April when the Olympic left New York on that voyage. And it listed some of the more prominent passengers who were going to be on the Olympic for that voyage. And so I started trying to dig into that and see, well, can I learn anything more about them? Were they interviewed later? Did they write books? What do we know about them? And the internet was a great source for me because at a certain point, I want to say it was about 2008, 2009, the UK started publishing online passenger lists for incoming ships. We had had the records of ships coming to America for a longer time, but the UK records were late in coming. And so when that happened, I was able to actually take that list of about 25 names of people I knew were on the Olympic for that voyage and start looking them up on the UK database. And I was almost to the end of my list when one of the names actually pulled up the record and it said, yes, this person was on the Olympic leaving New York on April 13th. Would you like to see the entire manifest? And if you clicked on that link, the actual photographs of the passenger list from that voyage came up on the website. So I was able to grab all of the names of everyone who was on the Olympic when the Titanic went down. And that gave me a hit list to really start doing the research to see what I could find out. And actually some of the names you can't, or even they're handwritten and they're hard to read, but every name that I could read, I tried to find out what I could find. And one interesting anecdote that I'll share with you today is one of the most notable people on the Olympic at that time was Mortimer Schiff, who would later found the Boy Scouts. And because he was the most prominently named person, I assumed that when I contacted his descendants, they would have journals and photographs, and they would have family stories about what it was like to be related to someone who was on the Olympic. And when I reached one of his descendants who lives in New York to this day, he didn't know that Mortimer Schiff and his family had been on the Olympic. That was news to him. And so it turned out to be kind of a dead end, but I thought that was interesting because, as we know, anyone who was on the Titanic or the Carpathia, their family tends to know that, and there tends to be a history, maybe even photos or a diary or something, or news clippings. But for the Olympic, it just wasn't the case. And what I have always attributed that to is, you know, they really were kind of tangentially involved. And I think for a lot of these people, they felt like it would have almost been ghoulish for them to talk about the fact that they were on the Olympic when this happened. I think that was kind of a sign of the times. And, you know, that was one thing that always frustrated my research. I kind of wish I had started my book 70 years ago, kind of like Walter Lord did, when all of the people who'd been on the Olympic for the most part were still alive and I could have possibly contacted them. It's much harder to do the work now when you're just looking at newspaper clippings and potentially diaries and journals and books. So at a certain point, armed with that list and with the things that I was able to find based on my research of the people who were on the Olympic, I just started writing to see how much of the story I could tell. And I started to realize maybe there's a book in this. So I talked to a friend of mine who's in publishing. It never occurred to me that one day I would write a Titanic book. I honestly didn't think there was anything new to say. and I certainly didn't think I was the one to say it. But I told her, look, you know, I've been working on this research for a while. Is this a book? What do you think this is? And she read it and said, I would advise you to talk to a publisher who already publishes Titanic books because they're familiar with the subject and they'll be able to tell you right away whether they think this is a book or not. So at that point, I had written a few chapters. So I sent one chapter, or no, I sent a synopsis to Amberley Publishing in the UK because they had recently published several Titanic books. And I thought, well, they're already doing it, so they'll be able to tell me what they think. I emailed them on a Friday, and on Monday, they wrote me back and said, we would like to see a sample chapter. So it all happened very quickly. And then I sent them one of the chapters that I had written, and they wrote me back and said, we're interested in publishing this. We need more. Let's talk. And from there, it became the project that it became, and they agreed to publish it. And it was published in 2011. So it's been almost 10 years since the book was published. And, you know, it's had modest sales, modest interest. One of the reviewers actually said this is one of the, and because it was published right before the 100th anniversary, it tended to get reviewed and put in with other books that were coming out at the time of the anniversary. And one of the reviews made me laugh because the reviewer basically said, well, this is surely one of the more absurd Titanic books you'll read this year because it's about a rescue that didn't happen. So there really isn't any need for this book. And then the reviewer said something like, but I found myself enjoying it anyway. So if you want to buy it, go ahead. Probably one of the warmer reviews. So there's that. And that's how the book came to be. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the members who've read it and any questions or conversations we want to have about it. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, hi, how you doing? This is Terry Bay, the co-host.
Terry?
I think like well, I'll have to admit I did this talk with Wayne on the phone earlier this year about his book.
Yep.
And this is a very impressive book. I have the book like right here. And it's like near the end of the book, it talks about how Captain Smith thought there should have been more lifeboats. And I'm just wondering, why didn't they listen to the captain? Why didn't they take his advice? It's kind of ironic that even he thought there should have been more lifeboats.
Yeah, and that's a lot of those statements that are from Captain Smith I got right out of contemporary newspapers at the time. So you wonder, did he really say all of that? Can we attribute some of that to yellow journalism at the time, or is that true? I think historians still debate that. I think several things that are in my book are still open to debate. For example, and I think that Captain Smith, those quotes from him are part of the debate, but I think one of the things that's also up to debate is, did White Star intend to name the Britannic the Gigantic, and did they change that name after the disaster? And all I can say is I found multiple newspaper articles before the disaster that referred to it as the Gigantic, and the White Star Line never took it upon itself to correct that until after the disaster. So I have to believe that for a certain amount of time, the plan was to call it Gigantic. And when you think about the names, certainly the theme is hugeness. Olympic and Titanic. Gigantic just seems to be the natural third in that. Britannic is an odd choice when you consider the names as a trio. So I tend to believe the contemporary newspaper articles at the time on that subject and on that score.
Well, that's interesting you brought that up, because I read, I can't remember which Facebook group it was. It might have been Titanic Enthusiasts. It might have been Connections, actually, that it wasn't true that they always planned to name it the Britannic. There were some documentation.
Yeah, it depends on who you ask and who you're listening to. I think it's still very much open to debate. And what I'm basing my opinion on are all of the contemporary articles of the time before the disaster. That's really all I have to go on. And I've seen some of the documents that people are referring to, but I also see Harlan and Wolff documents that list the name as gigantic before the fact.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And what about the quote where he says, "I can't imagine any ship sinking," or wherever that quote was.
And
A lot of
basically,
people have that. A lot of people have that saying he was saying that about the Titanic, but he wasn't. He was that was like a quote in 1907, or he said in 1906 or something like that.
yeah, that's true. And one of the misnomers of the Titanic story as well is we tend to think that the Titanic was the first ship that was ever referred to as unsinkable. But I'm sorry that I'm not able to credit who wrote this, but somebody has written a
Well, that
pretty
was in the
long
Shipbuilder.
piece.
That's in Shipbuilder. The Shipbuilder said that the Olympic and the Titanic were both practically unsinkable.
But
They
that
didn't say they were
wasn't the first
absolutely
time.
unsinkable.
They're actually, if you go back, they started calling ships unsinkable at least 10 years before the Titanic disaster. You can find
Right.
contemporary articles such as the Shipbuilder that called other ships that. So that was really nothing new, which I think, with hindsight, I think we tend to forget that. We tend to think the Titanic was the first ship that was ever said, and that's not true, which I think is interesting.
I just like to throw in a comment here, and then I see Alicia's got her hand up. Part of the thing too that made it into the papers was stuff that came out of the hearings, and stuff like the lookouts with the binoculars. There's stuff that made it into popular culture because the lookouts were somewhat trying to cover their butt. So, they said, yeah, binoculars would have helped, but we know that they actually wouldn't, because that's not how you do a lookout. So there are things in there that people have said that actually make it into being quote unquote fact that aren't. Let's go to Alicia.
Hi, Alicia.
Hi, Wade. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for joining us for this meeting. I did read your book, Breaking Through the Night, and absolutely loved it. As someone who has personally been interested in the untold stories, what happened on Carpathia, what happened on Olympic, even what happened on Californian,
Right.
I think there's definitely a need for your book, because your book tells the stories of the unknown, to see how Olympic was preparing almost in a very similar way that Carpathia was preparing, getting lifeboats ready, organizing passengers, getting ready to take on Titanic passengers. Their captains, again, almost have the very similar mindsets of what we need to do, that getting all those coal, the Black Gang get up and running to light more boilers.
Right.
Their stories won't be told if your book hadn't come out. Another thing that I absolutely love that I found out recently is I live about 45 minutes from Sandy Hook, and that's my beach. I have gone to the beach 100 times and never thought about its history. I recently learned that the Carpathia was met by the tugboats at the mouth of the harbor right there.
That's right.
I stood on that land and looked out on it during war, and then to find out that the Olympic.
Oh, that's great.
Not only crossed that multiple times, but that's what she dropped. What she dropped her propeller blade right there too.
She was stuck there not long after the disaster. Right.
I think that I stood on that land, looked out at that water, and I'll never see that water as the same. I also imagine the Carpathia or the Olympic and what she must have looked like sailing around that head, coming in,
Yeah.
What that must have been like for her passengers.
Well, and you're right, that was one of the things I found very interesting, was to learn that the Olympic was getting ready, and for several hours they had every thought that they would get to the Titanic in time. And there was even a first-class woman who said she kind of hated to put it this way, but she's like, it was almost kind of fun because here we were turning public rooms into hospitals and getting ready to help, and everyone was geared up to do their part to help. And then they had to very quickly change gears when they noticed that their ship was suddenly just back on the normal course, and then they slowly learned the truth. And that's another thing that was interesting to me, is that the Olympic crew and captain really did try to keep as much information from the passengers as they could, which it doesn't take much of a leap of faith to realize they were probably afraid of panic, because if they were to tell the entire story, these people are on a ship that also doesn't have enough lifeboats, and here they are going through the waters. I think they were just trying to get back to port before everybody learned what was actually happening. And I have a few photographs that I wasn't able to share in the book. I actually didn't know about these photos until after the book was published. And one of the photos actually shows the passengers of the Olympic right after they had gotten off the ship. You can see the Olympic in the background, and they're all standing around reading the newspapers because they're finally learning what they've been waiting to hear for several days, which is all the details and who survived and who didn't. So it's an amazing photo that I wished I would have known about. And a couple of the photographs that I wanted to share today, which Richard will share with us shortly. All along when I was researching this book, I thought, surely somebody took a picture of the Olympic when it first came back to dock, because this was one of the biggest news stories of the new century. And here was the nearly identical sister ship coming back for the first time. Surely some newspaper editor thought, we need to get somebody down to the dock and get a picture of this when it comes back in. But I never could find any such photo. And it was only after my book was published that I had somebody contact me and say, I think I have a photo that you're going to be very interested in. And it's one of the photos that at some point during this Zoom we will share. And you can actually see the Olympic. There's two views of it. When it first came within sight of land in Plymouth, England, and you can actually see the flags at half-mast, because, of course, by then they're in mourning for what has happened to the Titanic. So they're amazing photos, and if my book ever gets another edition, I have permission to add those two photos, and I certainly will, because I think they're very important to the story we tell in the book. But thank you for those comments, Alicia. Did you have any questions based on what you read?
No, I'm actually very good, thank you.
Yep.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I should say, I have learned a few things since the book was published that if there ever is a second edition, I would like to include. And one of them is, a family has contacted me and said that their relative was a third-class passenger on the Olympic when this happened. And to me, that's a very interesting story because, you know, third-class people tended not to be interviewed. We know that of the Titanic itself. I mean, third-class survivors didn't get the same priority as first and second, although because they were on the Titanic, eventually we did hear their story. And certainly, I don't know that we've heard from too many third-class passengers on other ships and not on the Olympic, but the story that they told was, and they had journals to reference, which they shared with me, this woman remembers waking up in the middle of the night and her cabin walls were shaking so badly, she was afraid her cabin was going to fall apart. And that's because she was in the lower part of the Olympic and they were driving the ship so hard that she said the walls were vibrating in a way they hadn't vibrated for the rest of the voyage. And I thought the paneling was going to fall off the walls, was her comment. So if we ever get around to another edition, and if the publisher's ever interested in that, that's one of the stories that we'll be adding. I should also go ahead and note that when I wrote the book, I was not aware of a Titanic researcher named Phil Gowan, who, through his extensive research, he established what are known as the Gowan numbers, which are now accepted as the official tally of who was on board, who died, who survived. And his numbers are 2,208 on board, 1,496 died, 712 survived. My book has the Walter Lord numbers, which I took to be the gospel of the time. But I've since learned that it's the Gowan numbers that researchers rely on for the actual tally. So my book is incorrect anytime I reference the number on board for Titanic, the number who died or survived. I just thought I would point that out.
I want to know, when you were writing the book and doing all the research, did you gain respect for certain officers or lose respect for certain officers, or any even some of the executives? Because when I was reading the book, of course I knew the story before, but I had lost a lot of respect for I forgot his name, so forgive me. The White Star Line
The White
president
Star Line,
in the New York office.
Franklin, right?
Franklin, yes. I
Right.
lost so much respect for him.
Yeah, he had a pretty arrogant view of it in the beginning, didn't he? Where he kind of yelled at that reporter and said, "That's the most outrageous thing I've ever heard." Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know that I really lost respect for anybody. I will say that even before I wrote this book, I haven't had the utmost respect for Second Officer Lightoller,
Yeah,
because
he's another one I don't respect, but go ahead.
I mean, I have a lot of issues with him. For one thing, I feel like his very rigid view of women and children only. There were several cases where there were men standing by who could have been put in the boat, who could have survived, and instead he lowered the boats not full. And I mean, obviously one example is John Jacob Astor basically asked to get in the boat, was refused, and sat and watched the boat lowered with empty seats. And, I think we could debate the virtues of women and children only versus women and children first all day. But I do think it's just kind of horrible that people died who didn't necessarily need to die. And I also question his decision to open that lower gangway door, which then added to the rate of flooding, and never really checked. And I realize, obviously, it's not really fair to be an armchair quarterback for this kind of a disaster, but it does make you wonder about some of his judgments that night. I don't know that it's necessarily fair for me to do that, but I do question some of his decisions, and of all the officers, some of his decision making seemed questionable to me.
Well, I was talking more about
You're talking about the Olympic and the
the
White
Olympic
Star
also.
Line.
Either ship. I liked Haddock. I really
Yeah.
admired him. I also
I
felt
did
sorry
too.
for him, because those on, like Smith, the first officer, even Wild. I mean, they were his friends too. So
Well, and he was friends with McElroy, the purser on the Titanic.
Yeah.
And so he knew a lot of those people personally. So yes, you do end up sympathizing for him, because this unimaginable thing happens and falls in his lap. And, he doesn't like having to face reporters, and then he finds himself in the middle of the biggest story to happen in his lifetime. So yeah, I do have a lot of sympathy for Captain Haddock as a result of that. But to your question, did I lose respect for anyone? I don't know that I'm not one of those people who finds the need to blame, or I see that in the Titanic bullet and the Facebook groups all the time. Who do you blame for this? I'm like, I don't know that it really helps to blame anybody. So I don't know. I haven't given that a lot of thought, to be honest.
Does anybody else have a comment or question?
You want to go through your pictures, Wade?
We sure can. Let's show those. So this is the first photograph that I was referring to earlier, that Gunter emailed me within a few weeks of getting a copy of the book. He said, "I think this photo is really going to interest you." And at the time, I don't think he didn't have all the information about this photo. He didn't have the caption that you're seeing in front of you now that says, "This is the Olympic coming into Plymouth on April 20th." He just knew from the photograph that this was a pre-Titanic disaster photo, because of everything we know about the Olympic and the lifeboats and the vents and the changes that were made in later 1912. And he said, "It's interesting to me that flag is at half mast, and that looks to be Plymouth Harbor in England behind it. He's like, this could be a picture of the Olympic coming in for the first time. And of course, we later found this in an actual British newspaper with the caption. So now we can say with certainty that this is one of the first photos of the Olympic coming back after what happened. So it's just kind of an eerie photo. It's a photo that I always believed existed out there somewhere and just couldn't put my finger on before the book was published. And I hope you all can see it clearly enough to agree that it's a pretty amazing photo.
Oh, I can see it now.
Yeah. And in the next photo, which is another photo of the Olympic coming into Plymouth, you can actually see the flag at half mast on the forward mast as well.
Oh, you didn't send me that one.
Oh, I didn't share that?
No, send me that one.
And this is obviously a 1912 photograph of the Olympic before they started adding lifeboats. So this is one of the first views we have of her when she got back to shore after what happened to the Titanic. So to me, it's another one of those eerie photos. This one actually is credited to the Postal Museum collection, which I think it's a pretty remarkable photograph. And then the third photograph that we have to share today is the one that I told you about earlier. This is Olympic passengers after they landed in Plymouth, standing next to the Olympic, and you can see some of them holding up newspapers, reading the bulletins, getting the news for the first time officially as to what happened to the Titanic while they were on their voyage. So to me, that's another great.
The Olympic lifeboat, or are they on like a tether ship?
I'm sorry?
Lifeboat in the background, is that from the Olympic, or is that?
That lifeboat is on whatever craft they're on there. It's okay. Whatever boat they got onto that will take them to shore when the ship docked. So that's not an Olympic lifeboat. It's whatever boat they're on there.
Or the Normic that they're on?
I don't think so, because this is Plymouth. So I actually don't know what ship that is that they're on, but it would have been a tender that White Star hired to bring people back. So I actually don't know the name of that boat. But it's a pretty remarkable photo, because you really do see that scene that we describe in the book where people, they even talked about how they rushed off the ship so they could grab newspapers to read what the captain hadn't been telling them while they were on the Olympic. And I believe we have a few more photos. Yes, this is a really good photo of the two wireless operators that we discuss extensively in my book, who were the wireless operators on the Olympic. You see Ernie Moore and Alec Baggett. And Alec Baggett actually, he wrote a book. He wrote his biography, which is in the archives in Australia to this day. And it's at a certain point, the Titanic Historical Society published excerpts from that in the Titanic Commutator, their journal. Oh gosh, I want to say it was in the 90s that they did that. And so throughout the course of writing this book, I tried to get permission from his descendants to be able to publish from his book in a more extensive way. And apparently I was one of the first people to ever really approach them about that, and they just weren't comfortable giving somebody permission to do that. So they never did give me permission to do that. So I wasn't able to extensively quote from his book. And honestly, I mean, there's a fairly large section that deals with his time at the White Star Line, but I was able to share the gist of what he shared in there, because of course he had experience working with Captain Smith before Captain Smith was transferred to the new Titanic. So he knew, kind of like Captain Haddock, he knew a lot of the people who were involved in this, because it was a company, just like if an airliner goes down today, chances are some of the flight attendants know people who died because you work for the same company, and at some point you all work together. The same kind of thing was at work between the people who worked on the Olympic and the Titanic. And that was certainly the case with Moore and Baggett. So that's a really great photo of those two. And this is them actually on the deck of the Olympic. This photo was taken after they became semi well known because of their involvement with the Titanic, because they both submitted their statements to the inquiry in New York. So we know a little bit about what happened to them because of the actual investigation transcripts. And then the last photo that we have to share is another Getty image. If you're curious what Captain Haddock looked like, that's him on the left. And you can see that distinctive hairstyle that he had with they called him the mutton chops, on his temples. You can see that in this photo. And that's actually a photo of him. He had to go to court when, right after the Titanic disaster, the crew of the Olympics, some of the crewmen refused to sail. And so there was a hearing about the mutiny. And this was him coming to give testimony at that trial right after those legal proceedings, right after the disaster. So this is what Haddock looked like roughly around the time of within a month of the Titanic disaster, which I think is interesting. I also really I was hoping to find photos of Captain Haddock. And one of the things when I was doing my research, I was doing a lot of research on Ancestry.com, and I came across an author who at the time was trying to write a book about Captain Haddock. And unfortunately, that author had a diagnosis of cancer during his research, and he passed away before he could finish his book. But he was actually living in a home where Captain Haddock had lived, and still had some Haddock memorabilia in the attic when he passed away. So I used to have correspondence with him and phone calls so we could compare notes about our research into Haddock and the Olympic. And we talked right up until the time that he passed away. And so those are the photos I wanted to share. Those are the photos that I had access to after publishing that might someday be part of a future edition.
Oh, they're very fascinating.
Yeah, I always find photos from back then to be very fascinating, even if they only tangentially have to do with the Titanic. It's just interesting to see how people lived back then. Did Melissa or Judith have any questions that they wanted to have answered during this?
I wanted to know, is it true also that the passengers, everybody was kept in the dark that the Olympic wasn't going to the Titanic survivors' aid because it would traumatize them too much because the ship looked so much like Titanic?
Well, there's kind of two separate things there. First of all, Olympic passengers were kind of kept in the dark about what was going on. There are a few announcements that were posted on the bulletin boards and public areas of the Olympic. In fact, one of the things, which I wish I had that photograph to share now, it's on my other computer, somebody sent me on Olympic stationery, one of the passengers on the Olympic actually wrote down word for word the text of the first announcement that was posted in all the public areas on the ship that everybody on the Olympic was able to read, which basically constitutes the only official word that they got through that entire voyage. And it basically just says what the Carpathia had told the Olympic, which is that the Titanic has sunk. The Carpathia has all of the survivors, slightly more than 700, and it's proceeding to New York, and we will go ahead and proceed on our course because there's no work left to be done. And the second part of your question has to do with, did the Olympic not go to the rescue of the Titanic because it would throw the Titanic survivors into shock? And what you're referring to there is, once the Carpathia reached the Titanic scene and started retrieving all of the lifeboats and bringing on the passengers, the captain of the Carpathia, Captain Rostron, and Bruce Ismay discussed what should happen. And there are varying degrees of how much we think Bruce Ismay was actually able to converse, or if it was just the captain of the Carpathia who made the decisions based on what he thought Ismay would want. We don't really know the answer to that. But it was decided, stated from Captain Rostron, that the Olympic should not come to the scene because we have already saved everybody who can be saved, and we think it's a bad idea for people who just survived the Titanic to see the Olympic. So We don't know if that was exactly Bruce Ismay's thought or if that was Rostron thinking for him, because at a certain point, we do know that they started giving Bruce Ismay medication to kind of help him cope with what he was going through. So we don't, that's kind of an open question, and that's something that you'll see debated, but that's why you hear that brought up. But that was never a consideration for Haddock when they were racing towards the Olympic, or I'm sorry, toward the Titanic. He never would have made that thought of maybe this is not such a good idea for them to see us. And of course, for the lion's share of the time that he was racing toward it, he thought they were going to get there in time to help. And I don't think he realized quite what he was going into. And you can, as you read the book and you read through the transcript of what was being said that night, you definitely get the sense that the Olympic really didn't have a sense of what was going on, because here's the Titanic saying, we're sinking, we've hit an iceberg, we're flooding, we need your help. And the Olympic is asking, but are you steering southerly to meet us? So obviously there's a bit of a disconnect between what's going on and what they, you know, and in their defense, I mean, it was a pretty unimaginable thing that was happening.
Yeah, like
I
in the
hope that
movie.
answers your question.
That
Yeah,
was good.
also, too, just to comment, I think it could be a question, but they were talking about having some of the people sent back to England, the survivors on the Olympic, and I think that's where the thing about passengers actually seeing that ship would have been very negative for them.
Yeah. And I think the captain of the Carpathia, because he had actually been there and seen the way everybody was, I think he realized people had already been through a pretty harrowing experience. And I think he genuinely just wanted to spare them having to do another transfer in mid-ocean, which is a fairly unusual thing. But I did think it was interesting. In one of the documentaries within the past 10 years, I heard something I'd never heard before. And I'm sorry that I'm not able to cite where I heard it or who it came from, but somebody made the statement that there was actually a third-class passenger who didn't realize the Titanic had sank and that there was this huge tragedy until they got to New York. She had never been on the ocean before, and she just assumed this was part of the deal, that you were on one ship that took you halfway across the ocean and then you transferred to another. And I'm not sure what exactly was going on in her world that she didn't notice all the things that happened in between that, but she just assumed the transfer to the Carpathia was a normal part of doing business in the ocean. And it wasn't until she got to New York and people told her what happened that she realized what she'd been part of. And I thought that was really interesting.
I think also, do you remember the part of the night to remember where, what's the name of that wireless, Cottam, Harold Cottam, he was going to shut it off for the night, but fortunately he got the message, and he writes, and he goes to the people on the watch, and he tells them that it's the Titanic, she struck a berg, she's sinking, and then the guy says, don't be a fool. And yeah. I gotta think that so you can't blame the Californian for being like, are you steering south to meet us? You know, you can't blame them for being incredulous. Of course, there's also that scene in the same movie where I think it's not the other one. It was the wireless guy who died. What's his name?
Phillips.
Phillips, yes, Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips tells Captain Smith, the Californian's 500 miles. The Olympic's 500 miles away. They wanted the Olympic. The Olympic wants to know if we're steering south to meet her. The idiots.
And the Frankfurt wants more details.
I just want to be like, oh, dude. I mean, talk about facepalm moments. I can just see how incredulous it was for some of these ships.
Yeah.
It said she was unthinkable.
Sorry, my video seems frozen. I also wanted to comment. Also, in the very early beginning, when they were just putting out their messages, I can kind of understand some of the confusion, not only the unbelievable of what was happening, but just trying to get information out from multiple people. I also want to comment, wait, I had heard the similar story about the passenger. Basically, what I think happened is she got in the lifeboat, fell asleep,
I
and
think
then
you're
didn't
right.
wake up until Carpathia had arrived. So I don't think that's kind of where she kind of got that disconnect I had heard, because I had heard the same thing,
Yeah.
supposedly.
What
Now
did
that
she
you
say?
say
I
that,
can't
that does ring
understand
a
her.
bell. What's that?
What did she say? She broke up a
No,
little.
that passenger I was referring to who just thought that it was normal to transfer from one ship to the other, she fell asleep, and that's why she didn't know the Titanic sank.
Oh,
She got into a lifeboat and was lowered over the side, and she just assumed they're just waiting for another ship to come get them to take them the rest of the way. She fell asleep, and it wasn't until later that someone told her, no, we actually were saved. That's why we had to get off the Titanic. So, yes, you're right. Now that you say that, I do remember that. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
that had to be a shock to her, though.
Well, and you're right. With the early messages, there was a lot of confusion, and I think part of the confusion just comes from the fact that nobody could believe it. I mean, you can't believe that the Titanic is actually in trouble. So you're trying to figure out who's in trouble and who's transferring the message and where's this coming from. And in those early messages, you can hear the confusion. And even Cape Race at one point said, we're not sure if it's the Titanic that's in trouble, but somebody's definitely in trouble, and they were trying to figure that out. So those early messages were very confusing. And then it wasn't helped that at a certain point, just when the Titanic was starting to convince people that something's wrong, she went silent because she no longer had the power to transmit, and then she was gone. So, there
Our
was,
boilers were flooding at that point.
right.
Right.
That's right. And the Olympic,
They lost power. They lost power.
the Olympic kept reaching out to ships for literally hours after the Titanic was gone, until finally there came that confirmation from the Carpathia that it's over and she's gone and there's nothing you can do. I mean, and I read through all of those when I was, and I include a lot of them in the book, those messages where she was just reaching out to every ship asking, have you heard from the Titanic? Do we have any details? Let her know we're still coming as fast as we can, and we're going to be there at this time. And, they really, I mean, for the Olympic, it really was an hours long mission. Long after there was nothing that could be done, she was still trying to get there, thinking that there would be something that could be done.
Wow.
And just another comment that we all know what happened.
Right.
I mean, it's easy for us because we know what the end result was. We know everything else, but the people that were involved that night didn't. And there's a lot of hindsight about, well, what would you do? Would you lash deck chairs together?
Right.
Would you do this? Would you do that? It's like, well, if I didn't know the ship I was on was actually sinking, why would I go through and do that to try and save myself when, I was assured that it's going to be okay? So, they didn't have a PA system on the ship, so it was all word of mouth. And same with everything, all the other ships, the Olympic and everything else. They got what they got, but they had no clue
Right.
or idea of what we know now. And if you look at the disaster with that perspective of knowing nothing, then it really changes what happened that night if you put yourself in their places.
Well, and thank you for that perspective, Richard, because I do agree with you that is very important to keep in mind, that there was no PA system on these ships. So in the case of the Titanic, Captain Smith didn't have the option to just pick up a mic and say, this is what's happening, this is what we need to do. I'm not sure that he would have done it even if he had the capability, because he was trying not to create panic. But the same thing was true of Captain Haddock. He had no way to get the word out to everybody all at once, and I'm not sure if he did, he would have wanted to either. So on both ships, you had this lack of information and this lack of understanding. And I don't think it was exclusive to the passengers. It's pretty clear on the Titanic that a lot of even senior officers didn't realize what was going to happen until fairly late in the evening, which is why some of them weren't weren't filling the boats to capacity, because I don't think a lot of them believed this was actually going to be how it ended. And the same was true of the Olympic. And for that matter, the same was true of the Carpathia. When passengers started to be roused on the Carpathia because they felt the vibration of the engines and they could tell that they changed course, they didn't know what was going on, and they were worried because they saw their own lifeboats being readied. For a while, they thought maybe their ship was in trouble. So you had that confusion. I mean, confusion was kind of the theme of the night, which is really
Yeah.
understandable given what happened. And as Richard said, we all have the benefit of hindsight now. And if you want a modern parallel to this, think back to what you thought when you first heard the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane, and those initial reports said it was just a small commuter plane. You probably thought, oh, what a horrible accident. I mean, you weren't immediately thinking, oh my gosh, we're under attack, this is horrible, I need to call people. I mean, it's a world event that's happening in real time, and it takes time to catch up to what's actually happening. And that was certainly true on April 14th, 15th, 1912.
That's interesting you brought that up, because I always compare I always say the Titanic was 9/11 before 9/11. Do you remember how the ship was sinking and people were jumping off the ship? You remember how there's the famous picture, the falling man. People were jumping off the World Trade Center, like people jumping off the Titanic. Right. And do you remember when people were trying to find their loved ones on the Titanic? They had to go back and forth for those big boards and whatnot. Yeah. Don't you remember after 9/11, people were putting up pictures of their loved ones trying to find them?
Oh yeah, there's no question that there are many parallels. Yeah.
The parallels is just if you know your history.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say you bring an interesting point too about information and how lack thereof. My experience with September 11th was I was working in a little store in the mall, and we were told that it was missiles and bombs, not an airplane. We had a security guard come running into our store screaming that they were bombing New York with missiles and that we had to run and evacuate because they were going to bomb us next. Yeah. It wasn't until later that I found out that it was planes.
Yeah. And you think of all the false stories that come up and all the false stories for the Titanic. When you think of the story of, well, no, it wasn't sinking and it's being towed to Halifax, and then so White Star hires trains to go start
all
getting
passengers saved.
Yeah. And that's true of any world event like that. I mean, there were false things that were said when President Reagan, when the assassination attempt happened on him, and the initial report said that a Secret Service agent had been killed, so that Secret Service families were assuming that their loved one might have died, and that wasn't corrected for hours. I mean, the same thing happened when President Kennedy was killed. They thought a Secret Service man had been killed. Clint Hill's wife thought her husband was dead for a while. I mean, that happens in any big story like this. Anything that gets reported initially, because the whole world's listening, even if you go back and correct those things later, there are always going to be people out there who repeat it, and it's always going to be around. And the Titanic, certainly, you could write an entire book full of all of those things that have always been said about it. And I'm sure we all get those clickbait articles all the time about, 25 things need to know about the Titanic, and most of them are these stories that we've known since 1912 are not true, but they're always going to be out there.
Well, especially today, since everyone wants to be first instead of wanting to be correct. Well, I think it's always been like that,
Well, and I think there's an interesting thing happening now with history where everybody wants there to be some new chapter, some new clue. So we have things like the switch theory or the coal bunker fire or the solar flare. I mean, I guess we're just going to have these constant, and that's not to say that there might not be some validity to some of these things. Like, for example, I mean, obviously there was a coal bunker fire. Don't get me started on the switch theory, but I mean,
switch theory is not true, and everybody knows it.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
The solar flare, that's the new one.
The solar flare is the newest one. That is right.
I think it's just, in a way, it's so hard to think that a block of ice sank a giant ship. You
Right.
almost need to see it couldn't have just been the iceberg. It has to have been this or that. It can't just be what it was because it's so unbelievable that something like ice did that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I
I
always
keep
think it's very interesting. It just seems to me like people in 1912 were so superstitious, and all the people who had premonitions that it was going to sink. And I don't know if anybody's read the book. I think it's called Titanic, the Psychic in the Sea. That book that's from the 70s. Or maybe it's even 1980. It's a really good book if you haven't read it. Just full of interesting tidbits. By Rusty Brown, I believe, is the author.
Well, my favorite conspiracy theory is that the uh, Titanic and Queen Mary were switched, and it's the Titanic that's in Long Beach. There was a secret radio-controlled iceberg that came in the middle, and Captain Smith was a space alien and was beamed off the bridge before it sank, and that's why his body was never recovered. So I
Wow.
just like to throw that out. Also, one of the things we're fighting now is the movie. Cameron's movie was so great at bringing people into Titanic and piquing their interests, but now we have a whole new set of uh, false information out there, and myths and everything that were started because of that. The real one is, Jack and Rose weren't real, and I still have people asking, did they ever recover Jack's body,
Oh
or
God.
I mean, seriously, I mean,
Yeah.
people really are, think that they were on the ship, and it's now we're having to re-educate a whole new generation
Yeah.
based on that. And with the
Yeah.
chime of the ship bells, I'm going to have to go. So I am going to turn this over to Terry, and
Okay.
I'll monitor. But you guys have fun, continue, and when you end the meeting, the Facebook stream will stop, and so will the recording. So y'all have a great day, and we will see you later.
Thanks,
Okay.
Richard.
Thank you,
Uh-huh.
Richard. And I
Thank
actually do need to go myself. I need to go make
Okay.
my dinner. It's been wonderful again speaking with you, Wade. Thank you.
Lisa. Thank you for your
Thank you,
comments. We'll
Lisa.
see you soon.
How much longer do you have,
Well,
Wade?
actually, we've reached the end of our time, but if anybody
Okay.
has any last questions, I'm happy to. I don't want to leave anybody hanging. Melissa, did you have
I'm
anything?
good. No, I'm good.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Melissa.
No
Thank
Terry, did
you.
you have anything else?
No, not really. I think we covered everything.
Yeah. Well, I just want
Of
to
course, my
thank
favorite
everybody for being
was one of my
here.
other. Oh, okay. Because one of the other things is like the people with the Rothschilds. That's the other one. That the Rothschilds had the Titanic sunk, and the other one is the. Oh, what's the other one? The one where the Titanic was sunk on purpose to kill Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim because they opposed the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, they're going to sink the ship on purpose just to kill 3 people. You kill 1,493 other people.
For me, it's still the switch theory. The one that really just boggles my mind.
Oh,
But
that one's crazy.
yeah.
That one's just crazy. How on earth can it would have been impossible. There were 1,500 men working on both ships, virtually at the same time.
I mean, in a way, I admire the person who came up with it because, I mean, it's fascinating to learn how their
I
mind
was gonna
works.
say it's
Really.
fascinating to hear.
But yeah, it's so.
Everything was every piece was numbered. You would have to physically put all the sheets of metal, everything into each ship. I mean, it's just impossible.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for spending the time here and for reading the book and discussing it. And I look forward to future Titanic book club chats. They're always a lot of fun. Take care, everyone.
Oh, wait a minute! Before we end this, I wanted to show you something. Where was it? Oh, where did I put my keys? Oh, I always leave my Can you see this? Can you
Oh,
see it
now I
now?
can. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's from first class paneling of the Olympic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I got the old girl.
one last comment. I'm on my phone on the way out the door. Sorry about the noise.
That's okay, because we're about to end the meeting, but go ahead.
Wade, please let everybody know where you can get your book.
Oh, yeah,
Sure.
where can we get the book?
Yeah, there's two places that I'm aware of where you can order it. You can order it on Amazon.com, which has versions of its site for pretty much every country. So if you're in Canada, there's a Canadian version of Amazon. You can also order it from the Titanic Branson Museum website, because that's where I tended to do most of my book signings. So they have signed copies of the book down there, and you can order them through their bookshop online. And I actually probably recommend that more than Amazon, because Amazon's pricing tends to fluctuate rather wildly. And there are times when my book costs several $100s inexplicably. And the Branson Museum always has a very reasonable price for the book. You can also buy it on Amazon as an electronic reader book if you prefer that. So Amazon or it's titanicbranson.com for anyone who's interested.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that question, Richard. And thank you for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, that's where I got mine. I was in Pigeon Forge. That's where I got yours.
Yeah.
Mine was autographed.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for everybody for coming. I appreciate it. Okay, bye, everybody. Oh, end.